We are recording.
Very good. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Anton Khlopkov. I'm director of the Center for Energy and Security Studies, OSNS in short, and moderator of the virtual meeting co-organized by United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, UNODA, the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, or CNS, and my organization, CNS. The title of our meeting today is the 10th NPT Review Conference, Challenges and Opportunities. As our meeting is virtual, it would be great help for all of us who have joined the meeting if all participants, except the speakers, mute their microphones and disable their cameras to avoid distracting background noises. I will wait for a few seconds to give the participants a chance to accomplish this task. Thank you. While the meeting we have is virtual, the challenges the humanity faces are real. Many analysts believe that the novel coronavirus pandemic is the greatest challenge facing humanity since the end of the World War II. Other analysts conclude that the risks of the use of nuclear weapons are higher now than at any time since World War II, while, as we know well, the arms control architecture is collapsing and the risks of nuclear proliferation are growing. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, is a cornerstone of the nuclear non-proliferation regime and a foundation for addressing proliferation challenges. The ongoing worldwide pandemic is a dramatic reminder that we are all in the same boat and the global challenges we face should be addressed collectively. While the 10th NPT Review Conference has been postponed, the state parties should use this hiatus to work together and to take advantage of additional opportunities in order to ensure a successful conference outcome. Our virtual meeting today seeks to foster dialogue on these issues and to help build the framework for a successful outcome to the 10th NPT Review Conference. Expert speakers will engage in a moderated discussion on issues affecting the REFCON, followed by Q&A session with the participants who have joined the meeting today. Before I give the floor to our first speaker, a few words about the format and ground rules of the meeting. The event is on the record and being recorded, so feel free to tweet as often as you like throughout the meeting. This is, I think, the good news. Each presenter will have up to 7 minutes for their remarks. The floor will be open for questions and brief comments after all scheduled remarks have been delivered by the presenters. If you have a question or brief comment, please raise your virtual hand by clicking the hand button in the meeting control bar on your screen. 2 or 3 rounds of questions will be conducted depending on the time available. I will collect up to 5 questions or comments during each round. When you have the floor for a question or comment, please limit your intervention to a maximum of 1 minute. All 7 presenters listed in the agenda are available for questions and will stay with us during the whole meeting. So all 7 of them will participate in the follow-on discussion. The meeting will be closed at 12:30 p.m. New York time, which means in 90 minutes after it began. Okay, now when the ground rules of the meeting have been established, I would like to give the floor for opening remarks to the United Nations High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Izumi Nakamitsu. Ms. Nakamitsu, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anton. Distinguished panelists, and those distinguished panelists are in fact all good friends of UNODA. It is a real pleasure to welcome all of you to this virtual event. I'm so pleased we could partner with our colleagues and friends at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies and the Center for Energy and Security Studies to arrange this panel. The COVID-19 pandemic has forced all of us into various forms of isolation, but it is indeed heartening to see how people are working on innovative solutions to keep the world moving and to keep other important issues on the agenda, including the NPT. The postponement of the 10th NPT review conference was, of course, disappointing. But it is also, as Anton already mentioned, it could be an opportunity, one that NPT states parties really should use wisely to help see the grounds for success whenever the review conference is held. Because we must be frank, let's
Ms. Nakamitsu, we lost your voice, I'm afraid. Please check your microphone.
Yep, sorry.
Okay.
So I will restart because we must be frank. Heading into the original dates for the REPCON, there were more questions than certainties. Those questions continued to circle about preparation for the conference, and it is now up to states to get down to the business of resolving them. Of course, this is not to say that there have not been wholehearted efforts to date, just that those efforts really needs to be redoubled. I hope that the P5, or I should say N5, will continue their ongoing dialogue and come to the conference with a unified position on how to achieve progress on Article 6. I hope that the cross-regional and other groups of states are busy preparing innovative ideas for how to cross entrenched divides and plot areas of convergence. Above all, I hope that all states parties are preparing to approach the review conference in a spirit of compromise, flexibility, and with an understanding of the collective nature of the threats we face. Even in the time of COVID-19, nuclear dangers are worsening. As nuclear sabers rattle, the arms control regime disintegrates, and as new proliferation challenges emerge, the NPT remains a bulwark of international peace and security and a common means of finding our way back to common sense and the path to a world free of those potentially catastrophic weapons. The review conference is therefore an opportunity to reverse course. I see 5 key areas in which states initiate this process. First, they can reaffirm their commitment to the NPT and the commitments they have assumed as parties. Second, they can reaffirm the norm of nuclear non-use, that these weapons are in a class of their own and must never be used again. Third, they can agree on risk reduction measures and confidence building measures. Fourth, they can agree that challenges to the non-proliferation regime necessitate its adaptation to meet the evolving threats. And fifth, the review conference should set the scene for discussion on how to pursue disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control in a complex strategic environment where all nuclear problems are exacerbated by new challenges. The pandemic is teaching us that international crises can only be resolved through solidarity, compassion, and strong institutions. Surely these are lessons that can translate into the NPT and its critical mission. I really look forward to hearing the debates today and engagements through these wonderful virtual means. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, High Representative Nakamitsu, for your opening remarks and for excellent timing. I hope that all other presenters will follow your example. Our next speaker is Professor William Potter, Director of the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. Professor Potter, you have the floor for opening remarks too.
Thank you very much, Anton, and thank you to High Representative Izumi Nakamitsu for her excellent commentary. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, as the case may be. This is not exactly the same environment as Annecy or the RevCon, but it's still great to be with so many friends of the NPT, albeit virtually. Because we have such a rich program, I'm going to be very brief in my remarks, although I may be more pointed than some of the other speakers who are professional diplomats, but I think that's what's expected of me. Let me begin with the good news and then turn to the very bleak situation we confront. The good news is that we are fortunate to have an exceptionally talented president-designate at the helm and an unusually experienced team of main committee chairs already in place. That's a blessing, but they will need every bit of their diplomatic skill and perhaps magical powers as well to pull a rabbit out of the hat when states finally convene for the review conference. In my view, the challenge they face stems first and foremost from the overall state of disarray in global affairs, including with respect to non-proliferation. At a time when every nation on this planet is experiencing an extraordinary affliction provoked by a virulent but nearly invisible adversary, we are more disunited than ever, at least more so than I have witnessed during my 40 years in the non-proliferation business. The cleavages are growing day by day, as are attendant nuclear risks. The bilateral and multilateral arms control architecture that served us very well for the past half-century is crumbling and is on the verge of total collapse, something that almost certainly will transpire should nuclear testing resume, as some would have it. Yet we seem at a loss about how to take corrective action. To quote UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, "A wind of madness is sweeping the globe, making everything more unpredictable and uncontrollable." Compounding this problem is that many states parties seem to be afflicted by collective amnesia, all too willing to forget what they agreed to at past NPT review conference meetings under the pretense that conditions have changed and therefore prior commitments are no longer relevant. If that argument is given credence by NPT parties, one must ask, what is the utility of negotiating further agreements, including even watered down consensus review conference outcome documents? My penultimate observation is that what we often observe in the NPT review process has little connection to proliferation developments writ large. This leads me to caution against treating the success or failure of the next review conference as a meaningful test of the health of the NPT or the broader non-proliferation regime. Witness the usual reluctance of states parties at NPT meetings to devote any attention to issues such as nuclear brinkmanship in South Asia, or for that matter, nuclear force modernization in the United States, Russia, and China. In other words, we must face up to the fact that there is a surreal quality to the NPT review process, and we should not place too much faith in its improved performance, regardless of the acuteness of the threats we confront. Nowhere is this more evident than the reluctance of the past 3 PrepComs to grapple in a meaningful fashion with the frequently noted shortcomings of the so-called strengthened review process. In this regard, perhaps there is merit in the idea proposed by Tariq Rauf to take a bold step and consolidate the next review conference with the PrepCom scheduled for Vienna in 2022. Such an innovation, driven in part by necessity, would enable us to have more confidence that by then the pandemic would have receded. The additional time and the possible appearance of new political leaders in some key countries might also make possible the adoption of more prudent arms control and disarmament policies. My final point concerns what I regard to be the most acute nuclear danger today, the potential for the United States and the Russian Federation to stumble through accident, miscalculation, misperception, and due to the total erosion of respect and trust, into an escalatory process in which regional crises involving their forces might actually result in the use of nuclear weapons. Regrettably, this dire situation involving the US and Russia now appears to be emerging in US-Chinese relations as well, a development that can only spell disaster. I would hope our distinguished panelists will offer some creative ideas about how we can address these risks in the NPT review process, embrace meaningful nuclear risk reduction measures, and commit in one fashion or another to the enduring principle that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. If we are unable or unwilling to do so, I fear that the pandemic we are experiencing in the biological sphere will only be a prelude to a far more devastating nuclear nightmare. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Next, we have three panelists. And first, I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Maria del Socorro Flores Liera, permanent representative of Mexico to the Conference on Disarmament. Ambassador Socorro Flores, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good day to all. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this webinar. I feel honored to participate, as keeping momentum through substantive dialogue is extremely important for the NPT process. As said by previous speakers, we are living in a complex and dangerous times. Most of the international architecture on disarmament and arms control is being eroded by the same countries that understood its importance. Apart from the demise of the INF Treaty and the most likely termination of the Open Skies Treaty, the perspective of the New START's extension is clouded in pessimism. Some nuclear powers are considering resuming nuclear tests. There is a rise in military expenditure, including for the modernization of nuclear weapons, contrary to the NPT. And we hear mutual accusations among nuclear weapon states and even inadmissible rhetoric on the use of force. No wonder why the doomsday clock was recently adjusted forward. The COVID-19 crisis has shown us that there are other immediate dangers that need to be addressed, and that nobody can be secure if we all are not secure. We need to strengthen cooperation if we want to tackle together current challenges, including nuclear disarmament. It is in this very difficult context that we are approaching the 10th REPCON. Some argue that the postponement opens up a window of opportunity for a successful outcome. I am cautiously optimistic. I hope that, bearing in mind the new reality and global realization, all actors will revise carefully their priorities and truly engage to ensure a positive outcome. I will highlight some issues trying to address the questions posed by the organizers. And first, the NPT has been successful in limiting non-proliferation and ensuring the right to access nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. However, in the pillar of nuclear disarmament, limited progress has been achieved. It is crucial to understand that the Great Bargain, the basis to adopt the treaty and its indefinite extension, is precisely the fulfillment of the premises that give content to the three pillars. Two, the conference should reinforce the importance of compliance through the reaffirmation of existing commitments and provide a path toward their full implementation. It is deeply concerning that some states are citing the current security environment as an impediment for any progress in the field of nuclear disarmament and renege their commitments due to its supposed lack of relevance in the current scenario. Such a narrative is sowing the seeds of discord, mistrust, and lack of belief in a real commitment by the state parties, particularly nuclear weapon states, with the fulfillment of the treaty damaging its effectiveness and validity. Arms control and disarmament are not fair weather activities. Meaningful disarmament can facilitate and improve security environment by building confidence and trust between partners. These are not just empty words or fantasizing. It is the experience that leads to the adoption of the NPT, which should be highly cherished by all its parties. 3, to ensure a successful outcome, there is a need for committed leadership by the nuclear weapon states and other relevant actors. Mexico participates within a group of like-minded countries that have been bridge builders and that are taking this role seriously through substantive proposals to facilitate a meaningful outcome of the REPCON. The New Agenda Coalition actively promotes nuclear disarmament through the full and effective implementation of Article 6 of the NPT. We will continue to recognize the value of the 13 steps toward disarmament and the 2010 action plan as key to achieve that objective. Through the preparatory process, NAC has presented working papers with concrete proposals to enhance our commitment. Other group, the NPDI, a group that represents a diversity of views and geographical regions, has also presented concrete proposals to facilitate compliance with the NPT 3 pillars, understanding that they are independent and mutually reinforcing. Those proposals have been carefully crafted and deal with, amongst other issues, transparency, nuclear risk reduction, and strengthening of the NPT review process. Mexico recently joined other 16 countries in issuing a communique on the 50th anniversary of the NPT entry into force. While it recognizes the value of the treaty in contributing to international peace and security, it also underlines the urgent need to implement concrete, transparent, verifiable, and irreversible nuclear disarmament measures to fulfill the obligations and commitments based upon agreed benchmarks and timelines. Given time constraints, I just will mention a very few additional areas. First, we need a human-centered security paradigm to nuclear disarmament. Conceptions focused solely in state security through deterrent policies is not sustainable. Therefore, building on the recognition of the 2010 agreement on the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and the reaffirmation on the need for all states at all times to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law, there should be a more nuanced recognition of the scientifically proven health, environment, gender, and socioeconomic impacts. While COVID-19 has demonstrated the lack of preparedness nationally and collectively to confront a non-military security threat, we should fully comprehend that in case of a nuclear detonation, no preparation is possible to deal with the magnitude of the consequences. Just some words on nuclear risk reduction, because I think it's a very important topic of discussion in the REPCON, but it should be approached cautiously, as it can be understood differently by different actors. It should be grounded on the understanding that the total elimination of nuclear weapons, to which we all have committed, is the only certain means to avoid its risk, and the focus should be both on disarmament and non-proliferation measures. Finally, we think we should pay more attention to gender and increase participation of civil society. The pandemic has demonstrated the link that exists between disarmament and development. We are clearly not operating on the basis of business as usual. This pandemic has affected fundamentally the social and economic structures of our societies. There is an offensive contrast with the enormous resources allocated to military spending, while counter-cyclical measures are needed. The new arms race is an affront to the commitment to fulfill the sustainable development goals. The next REPCON is the space for dialogue and for enhancing trust in the system built around the NPT and previous review conferences. We don't need to revise or change commitment. We need to focus on implementation through concrete measures. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Sakura Flores. Our next panelist is Ambassador Aidan Liddell, Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom to the Conference on Disarmament. Ambassador Liddell, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Anton. I hope you can all hear me okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just to begin with, to UNODA, CNS, and to CNS for convening this webinar. It's understandable, I think, that our focus over the last few months, at least diplomatically, has been on procedure, given the need to postpone and reschedule the RevCon, and that's easier said than done. But I think now we've taken those decisions and we have a route map ahead to a rescheduled RevCon. It's important that we get back to talking about the substance of what we're going to do in New York. So I'm very pleased that we're holding webinars like this that get us back onto the substance and build momentum to the rescheduled RevCon. That, however, is easier said than done. The world feels totally different from how it did 6 months ago. And it's impossible to say how it's going to feel 6 months from now. So I think in that sense, it's too early to say how the postponement itself and how the pandemic more generally is going to affect the context when we finally meet for the RevCon. I would like to think that it would underline the importance of international collaboration to solve global problems. But on the other hand, it may well exacerbate existing tensions instead. Politics in all of our countries is changing in ways we don't yet understand. We're also facing an economic catastrophe, not just a public health catastrophe, and that will have an impact, of course, on defence budgets, on peaceful uses budgets, and so on and so forth. That will affect the NPT. The situation's nothing to do with the pandemic particularly, but the situation in the DPRK and in Iran will be different from now. But again, it's difficult to predict how. The role of peaceful uses of nuclear technology could have evolved in new and potentially quite interesting ways, but again, we don't know. So I think monitoring and evaluating and analysing these trends and others that we haven't yet spotted is going to be a crucial task for us over the next few months as we prepare. And again, I think discussions like this, bringing in a wide range of perspectives, is going to be really important as we pick our way through this new world. Having said all that, the overall UK objective, at least for the 10th RevCon, remains unchanged. We want a consensus outcome that celebrates the achievements of the NPT across all its pillars over the last 50 years and the last 25 since the indefinite extension, and which charts a way forward which doesn't let what we disagree on detract from what unites us. There's clearly many different ways of packaging that sort of outcome, and we're open-minded about that, but I think that's the goal to which we're aiming. That, of course, should certainly involve commitments that build on what we've already agreed. Socorro said rightly that we recognise the value of the 13 practical steps in the 2010 action plan, and they've dated remarkably well considering they're now 10 and 20 years old, respectively. We also, however, need to adjust our route map to take into account the current situation. Whether that's the security environment, which does matter, states' postures, modern technology, and various other things. All of these things affect the situation in which we're currently working without detracting from what we've concluded in the past. The UK's work in this review cycle has focused on a few key areas I'll just go into briefly now, which I hope will be important for the RevCon as well. And I think these are areas where the RevCon could usefully focus. They are transparency and dialogue, verification, safeguards, and peaceful uses. First, transparency and dialogue, I think we've all recognised for a long time is important for building trust and confidence, both amongst the nuclear weapon states, which affects the security environment, but also between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. The UK has been working hard on this over the last few years. You'll all be aware that we published a draft of our national implementation report before the third PrepCon, and we've held consultations and dialogue on that before we prepare our final version before the RevCon. The P5 conference, which we hosted this year, and I'll say a bit more about the P5 later, involved an unprecedented level of civil society dialogue and transparency, I think. We're also been very pleased to fund the project that BASIC have been running on nuclear responsibilities, which we feel might be a new and interesting way of reframing dialogues which perhaps have been stuck in a rut around nuclear issues. So it's things like that we think might provide a way of resetting dialogue. The second area is verification. Again, this audience will know it's a fundamental technical challenge to a world without nuclear weapons under strict and effective international control, which is what we're aiming at. The UK has long been a champion of technical, practical verification work through the Quad, through the IPNDV, and through the group of government experts, and we continue that, including in the next round of the group of government experts, which we're a keen champion of. The third area, non-proliferation. This has been a great success again of the NPT, and particularly I think in the last 20 years or so. But we need to remain vigilant, as the DPRK case has shown us. We want the RevCon to support the IAEA's work on safeguards. These have to be allowed to evolve to remain relevant to the 21st century, and particularly in the light of technological developments. So I think the RevCon needs to ask whether we can collectively do more to encourage wider acceptance of the additional protocol in particular. And the final area I mentioned was peaceful uses. We were going to be hosting the culmination of the Pillar 3 conferences in London back in April. We're still committed to doing that, hopefully in November. We're looking for a new date which will work with the new RevCon timing. But as I mentioned earlier, the pandemic has demonstrated once again that the peaceful uses of nuclear energy are broader than just energy generation and are relevant to all sorts of challenges that we face today. The IAEA, for example, has facilitated the provision of nuclear-derived COVID-19 diagnostic kits to around 120 countries. So I think there's some really interesting new examples of the importance of peaceful uses and how the NPT supports that technology to be spread around the world in a safe and secure way. I'll just come back to the P5 process to conclude my opening remarks with. As you know, the UK has had the honour to convene the P5 process over the last year. Of course, the 5 nuclear weapon states are not a monolithic bloc. We each bring very different approaches and policy perspectives to the RevCon. We have different national priorities and so on and so forth. But the P5 process over the last 10 or 11 years has allowed the nuclear weapon states to coordinate better and to try and shape a sort of collective contribution to the RevCon. And I think it's accepted that having a degree of coordination amongst the P5 has been important over that time. I think in terms of this RevCon, the shape of the collective P5, N5 contribution is becoming clear. It's going to be around transparency and dialogue, again, particularly on nuclear doctrines. It's going to be about intensifying work on strategic risk reduction, as Socorro mentioned earlier, and on the FMCT. It's about ongoing discussions with ASEAN on the treaty, the Bangkok Treaty Protocol, which is unfinished business in terms of nuclear weapon-free zones and our support to nuclear weapon-free zones. It'll involve the publication of the second phase of the glossary of key nuclear terms, which is a very important transparency, dialogue, confidence building tool, as well as a technical and practical contribution to nuclear disarmament. And there'll certainly be a contribution on peaceful uses as well. We've agreed that we'll hold a joint side event on P5 approaches to peaceful uses, but I hope we can use this time to build up that contribution even further. The timing of the next P5 conference, of course, is yet to be decided. We agreed in London in February that France would host that, but quite when that will happen in relation to the rescheduled RevCon is to be decided. But of course, the P5 continue to work hard on those issues that we agreed on in London, and we hope to use the extra time to progress those even further. I'll leave it there. There's plenty more we can discuss later, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. But as I say, I think it's really important that we're having this conversation. I look forward to several more over the next few months, and hopefully by the time we reach the RevCon in January or whenever it might be, we'll be in really good shape, and we can aim for as good a result as possible to celebrate the successes of this important treaty and strengthen it for the years to come. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador Little. Our next panelist is Ambassador Ben Lagner, resident representative of Switzerland to the IAEA and permanent representative of Switzerland to the CTBTO Preparatory Commission. Ambassador Lagner, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Anton, and good morning, afternoon, or evening to everybody, wherever you are It's a pleasure to be on this panel. Whether the postponement increases the prospects for a successful review conference will of course depend to a large extent on how the general context evolves. At present, it doesn't look very promising, and I would be less optimistic that it is likely to improve. It may even deteriorate further. It seems therefore difficult to see how we can reach an agreement on a traditional, comprehensive consensus outcome document, which has traditionally been the benchmark of a successful review conference. And this is where I think we need to be more flexible. The important thing is that we can have a good substantive debate on important issues and also think creatively about possible alternatives to this traditional big document that could capture the debates and could therefore still contribute to a successful review conference. Of course, the postponement offers some opportunities. They have been mentioned. We have additional time. We have additional time to try and find compromise language on some of the key issues where we will not be able to agree. For example, how do we view the TPNW? Here, of course, cross-regional bridge building groups have an important role to play. And Switzerland is a member of one of the newly formed cross-regional groups, the so-called Stockholm Initiative. The Stockholm Initiative clearly wants a successful outcome of the review conference, and we have put forward a number of very concrete proposals, which we think are achievable, especially in the area of nuclear disarmament. The additional time can, of course, also assist us in our national preparations, in preparing our national reports and also working papers. Of course, there are also challenges that the postponement brings with it. The risk of a loss of momentum in the preparatory process. But I think exactly this webinar and hopefully others that will follow are an opportunity to maintain this momentum. One risk definitely is the attention of policymakers. This will be very much consumed in the coming months with the pandemic and dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic. One positive effect of the pandemic can of course be, and this has already been mentioned by our Mexican colleague, a broader paradigm in the area of security. It has highlighted the importance of human security as a broader concept than the traditional state-centered approach of security. This in itself could again also give a boost to the discussions on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons in the NPT context. Of course, one of the challenges could also be that it takes people's interest away from the nuclear issue and diverts it to the areas of biosafety or bioweapons. So it's difficult to predict, and there are of course a lot of uncertainties that accompany us. For example, one key uncertainty is the question of whether New START will be extended, and also the impact of the elections in the United States in November also have a significant effect on the review conference. Switzerland belongs to many countries that clearly are opposed to the idea of rejecting the validity of past commitments. Unfortunately, some states parties have been making statements in that direction. It is interesting that those who question the past commitments do this in a highly selective manner. This is not only short-sighted. Commitments in one area cannot be dissociated from commitments in other areas. You cannot expect people to remain committed to what they have agreed in the areas of non-proliferation and to walk away from the commitments in the area of nuclear disarmament. It also runs against the fundamental principle of balance that underpins the NPT. The NPT is not a la carte menu. The provisional agenda for the review conference that was adopted at the PrepCom last year clearly mentions also that the past commitments from 1995, 2000, 2010 have to be included in the review of the implementation of the treaty. Given the very different assessment among states parties on what has been achieved in the past 5 years, it seems very unlikely that we can reach a consensus on the review part of the implementation. Therefore, we will need a flexible approach. We've had it in the past. In 2010, we had an outcome document that did not have an agreed text for the review part. It was a text that was drawn up under the responsibility of the president. Another approach would be to also honestly reflect the differences where they are. There's no harm in doing this. It has to just be an honest reflection of where we are. The second major task of the review conference, besides looking at the past, is trying to look forward and identify areas where further progress can be made. The obvious point of departure, in my view, should be the 2010 action plan. Obviously, some actions have been overtaken by events, but other actions remain relevant and still need to be implemented. This was also the approach we adopted in 2015, when, in the context of subsidiary body 1, we tried to build on the 2010 actions and add more detail and specificity to some of them. We don't need a new action plan, but we need to identify on some priority issues from the existing action plan, where agreement may be possible. Risk reduction should be one of these issues. It is seen by many as a top priority in the current volatile international security context. It should therefore be a main topic of discussion in subsidiary body 1. Other issues where consensus recommendations would seem to be within grasp are transparency and supporting nuclear disarmament verification efforts. Now turning to the second and third pillars, as I'm based in Vienna, the review conferences have of course played an important role in securing the non-proliferation successes of the past. What can the 2020 review conference do to continue this trend? I would like to just highlight 3 areas that I think are particularly important. Further strengthening safeguards. There are political, technical, and financial challenges to further strengthening safeguards. The political challenges include, for instance, the existing legal framework. In 2010, at the time of the review conference, 18 states parties had not yet brought into force a comprehensive safeguards agreement. This has now dropped to 10. 102 states parties had in 2010 an additional protocol in force. This has increased to 136. Just over 30 in 2010 had a small quantities protocol based on the revised text. This has now risen to 62. But despite this progress, there is still a lot of work to be done. Re-endorsing the previous calls for action on these issues would therefore be a useful contribution by the 2020 review conference. We have heard some colleagues mention new and emerging technologies as a challenge. Export controls are an important instrument to ensure that new and emerging technologies are not misused for proliferation purposes. The review conference should again include language calling on states parties to establish and implement effective national rules and regulations, and to make use of the guidelines and standards adopted by multilateral regimes such as the NSG and the Tsanga Committee. Finally, another important issue in the area of non-proliferation, nuclear security. There has been a lot of work done in the past years on strengthening national nuclear security regimes and the global nuclear security architecture. The recent international conference on nuclear security, organized by the IAEA, was a remarkable success and adopted a substantive ministerial declaration. This declaration contains negotiated and agreed language that could be useful for the work in Main Committee 2 and for a RevCon outcome document. And it would be useful if the RevCon could highlight some of the key elements of this ministerial declaration. Of course, we also have the regional and country-specific non-proliferation challenges. And this year, I think the Iranian nuclear issue and the JCPOA will play a much bigger role than in 2015. It is difficult to see how debate can be avoided on this issue this time. And it is also difficult to see at this stage how consensus language can be found on this for an outcome document. At least we can expect a heated debate. At the worst, it could even be an issue to derail the conference. There are a number of difficult issues in this context. While the vast majority of states parties see the JCPOA as a major contribution to strengthening the international non-proliferation regime, the United States and some other countries will hardly agree to share this positive assessment.
Mr. Lagner, I apologize for interrupting you, but if you will wrap up within the next 30 seconds, I would appreciate that you speak for 10 minutes.
Okay, well, the other issues are, of course, the current situation of the JCPOA, and then, of course, we have the issue of the arms embargo looming in the Security Council in October. And finally, peaceful uses. Of course, this has always been a non-controversial issue or not a very controversial issue. Clearly, many states parties benefit from the work done in this area. Here, also, this has been one of the issues that has been in the focus for the preparatory process leading up to the review conference. That's very useful. It can link us to the wider agenda of sustainable development goals, which are important for many countries. But my view is that, however wishful it is to highlight activities in this third pillar, it cannot substitute alone for a lack of action and new forward-looking steps in the first pillar. Thank you, and sorry for going over the time.
Thank you, Ambassador Lagner, and I apologize for interrupting you, but this is my job today to take care of timing of the meeting. Our next speaker is Ms. Gauhar Mukhadjanova, Director of the International Organization and Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. Ms. Mukhadjanova, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anton, and thank you to UNODA and CNES for partnering with the James Martin Center in organizing this webinar. I have a very challenging task of responding to some of the excellent points by the three speakers, and I'll try to be brief and to the point. So it's interesting to know that there clearly are some common threads in the remarks concerning the challenges and opportunities for the review conference, and a bit more heavily on the challenges side. And so the 3 points that I note in particular, or the 3 common threads, are the effect of the crisis in the US-Russian relationship. It's the issues that are brought forward by the pandemic itself, and chief among them is the issue of human security and the relevance of nuclear weapons in this concept of security. And then it's the role and the future of past REFCON decisions and commitments, and mostly these present challenges, but then again, there's some opportunities could be hidden in there. With regard to the crisis in the US-Russian relationship, it's not only affecting the arms control and the disarmament pillar of the NPT, but also, as Bill mentioned, it's spilling into the non-proliferation realm rather unusually. And chief among disagreements there is the JCPOA. And what I note with concern is that this is not just a challenge for this upcoming review conference. This is something that can be very damaging for the regime in the longer term. The crisis in arms control in particular did not start with the current US administration, really, and it will not simply end if the elections in November bring about a democratic winner. And that's something that we need to really honestly think about. Because it's very tempting to just hope for the outcome, good outcome for most of us, in November, and then think that it's going to be all returned to normalcy. This is far from certain, and it's something that the states should somehow try to prepare for and consider the longer-term future of the regime, where some of its main key actors may not be as interested or as invested as they used to be from the beginning. On the subject of human security, I think it's been noted by almost everyone how the current pandemic brings to the fore the need to reassess what indeed constitutes state security, what are the major threats and how to approach them, and what indeed is the place of nuclear weapons in this whole concept of national and international security. And another aspect is, of course, the response capacity or lack thereof. And I think that feeds not only into the humanitarian discourse writ large, but also into the particularly topical discussion about risk and nuclear risk reduction. And in the past several years, we've mostly concentrated on the probability side of that equation, whether we have a higher probability of use of nuclear weapons. And the other aspect, how to respond to a potential case of use of nuclear weapons. Is there a national or international capability to do so? That has faded a little bit more into the background, and I think the the pandemic raises those questions again. On the one hand, it's good. It's a necessary discussion. It's important. On the other hand, as was mentioned before, it does have a potential of exacerbating some of the divisions that we witnessed in the previous review cycle. Up until recently, I did not at all expect the TPNW, for example, the ban treaty, to be a core disagreement necessarily, because the states on the humanitarian, on the ban treaty side, were prepared not to make it sort of the central point of debate. But the reemergence of broader questions underlying the very logic of negotiating that treaty, I think that might bring back the divisiveness that plagued the review cycle leading up to the 2015 review conference, and that's also something to consider in the run-up to this 10th one. Now to the issue of past REFCON commitments, and that seems to be truly the central point in the discussion in the past several months. And I note that there is a broadly shared view among NPT state parties that past commitments remain valid, and that they should be reaffirmed and in some cases defended against attempts to undermine or sometimes outright dismiss their validity or relevance. And that transcends regional and ideological divides, so that's good news, and could potentially be a basis for some kind of a broad agreement at the next review conference. Admittedly, though, that is a fairly low bar to clear. And on the less good news side is that there's a lot less clarity on what to do with these commitments in terms of both the review of their implementation and taking them forward. There are methodological and, of course, political challenges to conducting an objective, effective review of implementation, not to mention actually agreeing on this language by consensus. So it's not only is it unlikely that the 10th review conference agrees on the review part, as Ambassador Lagne mentioned, by consensus, but it's also questionable that we will ever really have a proper consensus-agreed review. You would note that even in the good old 2010 REFCON, we didn't have the consensus agreement on the review part. And by the way, happy 10th anniversary to the action plan, which was adopted exactly 10 years ago today. So in that regard, it is probably time for states and interested experts to look seriously and above all practically at what exactly they're trying to get out of the review. And see if there are ways, like one of the suggestions, to have sort of an honest account that is not agreed, or at least honest account of what different states consider to be assessment of implementation, and leave it at that without trying to find the lowest common denominator on which all states can sign on. So that's as far as the review part goes, and we can admit in that kind of format, we perhaps can admit that while past commitments writ large remain valid, there are certain steps that are no longer implementable as phrased, right? We can recognize that some treaties don't exist, and then taking it from there, discuss why, and also highlight that the issues underlying those steps when they were adopted, they are still relevant, right? So if we don't have CTBT in force, it doesn't mean that the CTBT is no longer relevant. It only means that we have work to do. If
Gauher, we lost your voice, I'm afraid.
They remain relevant. Okay, so what was the last thing you heard? Still nothing?
We can hear you now. Please continue.
Okay, what was the last thing you heard, so that I know where to start, where to pick up? All right. Right. So I'll just soldier on like nothing happened, because we're talking about REFCON, and that's what we do at REFCON. All right. At least Ambassador Little can hear me, I can tell. So we can acknowledge that certain treaties no longer exist, but then we have to also underline that the issues themselves remain relevant, right? So issues like bilateral arms control or the anti-ballistic missile defense problem. So So this is one area where states can consider practical approaches to conducting review at the next review conference. On the forward-looking side, I very much like the idea of building on at least the 2010 action plan and identifying some more specific priorities and benchmarks. It is a very rational and logical idea, but it is also hard to see realistically states agreeing by consensus on specific targets at this upcoming 10th review conference, considering some of the positions of nuclear weapon states in particular. And so this is a challenge, and it's also an open question whether arriving at some specific measures and targets in only certain areas like risk reduction or transparency or verification would indeed be enough for the majority of non-nuclear weapon states. And I think Ambassador Flores already sounded some caution about at least the focus on nuclear risk reduction. But that said, I think that is the most important, perhaps, the practically possible area for states to focus on in their preparatory work in terms of doing their own consideration about what they want to get out of the review in practical terms and reaching out to countries both like-minded and sort of across the aisle to see if they can work out some more or less common approaches in the run-up to the 10th review conference whenever it might actually convene. And as a final note, just to try to step back a little bit and maybe say something more uplifting, this is the 25th anniversary of the indefinite extension. People have mentioned 2010 action plan, people have mentioned the 13 practical steps. People don't mention the principles and objectives as often, but I think it's a good time to remember this is the 25th anniversary of the indefinite extension. It's a mini miracle that we have the treaty and we don't have to negotiate its extension again. It's possibly probably a good time to revisit the value and meaning that decision 25 years ago and the promises with which it came, and that includes the principles and objectives and the strengthened review process. And this sort of symbolically is a good time to both decide if we still stick by that decision, if we think it was a worthy while, and in what way can we improve the implementation of all those promises that went into the decision to extend NPT indefinitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Gauhar. Last but not least, Ambassador Gustavo Zlauvinin, President-designate of the 10th NPT Review Conference. Ambassador Zlauvinin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anton. First of all, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to CNS, CNS, and UNODA for having co-organized this event and inviting me to speak. In these exceptional trying times, events like this one are vital in keeping the community engaged on the review process and on the key issues that will be at the center of the 10th Review Conference. Secondly, I would like to thank those of you who have tuned in to attend this panel. It is a demonstration of the importance that all stakeholders continue to place on a successful review conference. Also, my thanks to the panelists, and I heard from them today some excellent assessments and views and even suggestions about the challenges and the opportunities presented by the review conference. In the lead up to the conference, whenever it's going to take place, there have been a lot of focus on the former, on the challenges. But if we are to succeed in producing an outcome from the conference that strengthens the treaty and its implementation, I believe that we need to start talking more about the latter, the opportunities. To this end, although the review conference postponement, it is a disappointment to all of us, I agree with the High Representative that it is also an opportunity, but it's one that we cannot afford to squander. At this stage, we only have the tentative dates of 4 to 29 January that I have asked as President-designate the UN Secretariat to reserve. I stress again that these dates are only tentative and cannot be confirmed until life returns to some semblance of normality at the UN headquarters in New York. But we should act as if the review conference is next month, that is, with a sense of urgency, because before we know it, whenever the conference is going to take place, the conference will be upon us and we will need to hit the ground running. Today, amidst the weeds of potential problems, I believe I heard some green shoots of convergence, areas of commonality that can help state parties find compromise with the goal to strengthen the treaty. In my view, a successful conference might entail, among others, the following aspects. First, a balance across all three of the treaty's pillars. Second, that to take into account the outcomes from the 1995, 2000, and 2010 review conferences. Three, to adopt some practical ideas to strengthen implementation of each of the treaty's pillars. And fourth, to take on board the voices of a diverse range of stakeholders as plurality of views helps produce lasting results. As we recently celebrated the 25th anniversary of the NPT's indefinite extension, it is worth remembering that this historical achievement came about due to an understanding that the strength of the treaty is the grand bargain at its core, upheld by mutually reinforcing pillars in service of the ultimate goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. Now, due to the extraordinary circumstances we find ourselves in, the 10th Review Conference may not be identical in form to its predecessors, but I can assure you that the Bureau and I are exerting all efforts to ensure that the conference will match the high standards that all states parties, civil society expects. Now, finally, to state parties, I say this much you can expect from me, but in turn, I hope that state parties will approach the conference ready to negotiate in good faith, willing to listen to the views and legitimate concerns of others, and able to recognize the collective value that we all derive from the treaty. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Aslauvinen. Now we are ready to open the floor for questions and comments, but let me remind first that if you have a question or a brief comment, please raise your virtual hand by clicking the hand button in the meeting control bar on your screen. If you have raised your virtual hand, please wait until I call you by name. When I invite a participant to put a question or voice comment, I will also specify who will be the next to speak after the current speaker. We will collect up to 5 questions or comments during each of the round, and I think we have time just for 2 rounds. And please keep your microphone muted when you are not speaking and unmute your mic before you begin speaking. When you have the floor, please state your name and current position, specify the question, who the question is for, and limit your intervention to a maximum 1 minute. So please raise your virtual hand if you would like to ask the question or make a comment. I don't see any at this stage. Does it mean that there are no any questions or comments, or we have some technical issues? This is the question to our good friends and co-organizers of this meeting in UNODA.
I see Amir Nazir from Malaysia raising his hand.
Okay, sir, please.
Thank you, Anton. I hope you could hear me. This is
yes,
Amir
sure.
from Permanent Mission of Malaysia to the UN in New York. In view of the time limitation, I'll go straight to my question. Thank you to the organizers. We've heard from the panelists that there is no guarantee of what the next few months will look like. It could be bleaker or it could be brighter. And there is a suggestion that geopolitical dynamics could continue to be more challenging for us. But I also believe for the experts, representative, policymakers, we could produce something substantive and constructive in the next few months. My first question, as I hope everyone is aware of the recent joint communique by 17 state parties with cross-regional representation outlining the steps to be taken moving forward, what do you think can state parties do in the context of the dynamics of all NPT state parties in the next few months? Because we know the ground and the landscape, all the players that have been out there, what can we do to improve the situation through this initiative, or what initiative taking note of all of the issues? Second question is addressed specifically to Ambassador Liddle. Thank you to your eloquent presentation. I'm glad to hear the UK leadership of the P5. You mentioned about transparency and dialogue, specifically about the dialogue between P5 and ASEAN countries with regards to Bangkok Treaty. As we move ahead post-pandemic era, in your judgment, Ambassador Liddle, what do you think can we do differently between the P5 and ASEAN countries to make sure that more progress is made as we try to conclude the process of signing and ratification of the additional protocol of the Bangkok Treaty by the P5? The first question is open to all, and second question is addressed specifically to Ambassador Liddle. Thank you, Anton, and thank you all.
Thank you. The floor for the next question goes to Ariel Penaranda, please. Ariel Penaranda, can you hear me? Please unmute your mic.
Hello, hello.
Yeah, we can hear you, please.
Yes, a pleasant day to all. To thank the panelists and speakers for their important remarks. The Philippines with Mexico, as mentioned by Ambassador Socorro earlier, also joined the joint communique to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the NPT. And we have also joined the NPDI in its most recent joint statement. We, of course, believe in the importance of efforts to bridge divergent positions to reinforce the NPT. And we emphasize the critical importance of building trust and confidence in all areas. And we believe that there's a need to resume constructive steps and positive engagement among concerned states to address issues on arms control and nuclear disarmament, particularly bilateral ones. We spoke about the accomplishments of the treaty and the success of the review conference. We believe will rest both on the celebration of the treaty's positive accomplishments, as well as our decisive, our uncompromising march towards a world free of nuclear weapons. And I took note of Ambassador Lagner's mention of the a la carte menu. We cannot be selective in our commitments, in the implementation of our commitments. The question I would like to raise is this: it has been stated that states should recognize that challenges to non-proliferation are not static, and therefore the regime cannot be either. What are your thoughts about the notion that the regime cannot be static, bearing in mind that states parties must abide by their commitments? And here I'm thinking about the 13 steps, the 13 practical steps, and the 64 action plan of the NPT. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Vanessa Wood from Australia has the floor next. Vanessa?
Thank you. Sorry, I hadn't unmuted myself. Thank you very much to the presenters. My question is for Benno Lagner, and I'm particularly interested in the question about how we build a workable platform on risk reduction out of the review conference. And I recall a seminar that UNODA supported earlier this year, where Switzerland made a really, really thoughtful, excellent presentation. And it was the first time I'd seen a state party really flesh out how we could actually build that platform. I mean, now that we actually have a bit more time, maybe some of the working papers can be front loaded a little bit and serve as a basis for consultation on issues like risk reduction. So if Benno has any comment about how that might be taken forward, I think that would be very useful. And also just to add NPDI, a few have been mentioning NPDI, but as the coordinator, Australia has been working with all of our partners on NPDI on a range of products for the RevCon, including a landing zone paper that hopefully could provide some consensus among states parties. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Daryl Kimball is the next.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you, everyone. Daryl Kimball with the Arms Control Association. I wanted to ask a simple question, maybe an obvious question of High Representative Nakamitsu and the other panelists. There was a recent report a week ago that one P5 state is actively considering a demonstration nuclear test explosion. Tell us whether you think that would create a more positive, less positive environment for the NPT and the global regime. I mean, this is the elephant in the room. As Ambassador Lagner said, it is possible that events may develop over the next few months that create a less favorable environment for the review conference and beyond. So I just wanted to give you a chance to offer your thoughts on that issue, please.
Thank you, Daryl. Now I would like to give the floor to the speakers to react or respond, and start with High Representative Izumi Nakamitsu. And when we will be back to the participants, Tariq Rauf will be first with his question or comment. High Representative Nakamitsu, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, to all the panelists, I listened very carefully all the presentations, and there are some really good points. I will take the last question that came from Daryl, which was also related to the overall environment. I think I agree with you. It could be the overall context environment could further deteriorate by the time we get to the review conference, whenever it might be. So my reaction to both Daryl's question and also what to do about this is, first and foremost, we need to have a really united, concerted messages from all of us, appealing to all actors, all countries, states, parties, not to do any destabilizing actions. And I say this has to really be a concerted messages, both in the public ways. As you know, we consistently call for all states parties to have restraints in their actions. This is not a time to do any destabilizing acts, including, of course, the potential nuclear tests. We don't have further information on that. We call on, of course, all parties to continue with the moratorium. This is one of the most important issues. It's squarely within a nuclear disarmament field. So we need to continue to appeal in the public spheres through our messages, but also behind the scene diplomacy of various countries to impress upon all countries to refrain from any destabilizing acts. we heard a couple of times, of course, the New START. One of the reasons why we want the New START treaty to be extended is because with the extension, we will also gain time. It's not just to make sure that further destabilization will not happen, but also we can also take advantage of the extension as a time to reflect on how to address various disarmament approaches in a very different context. We actually do agree with many experts from many countries that we no longer live in a bipolarity context. We no longer live in a static environment with all the technologies, etc. So I think there is a consensus that there will have to be new approaches and, in fact, a new vision for disarmament and arms control. But that would take time. It's simply not a very wise thing to do to throw out all the existing frameworks and regimes and architectures and then start thinking about some sort of a new framework. Rather, we suggest that we extend and uphold the existing frameworks, and we take the time in front of us to reflect on what are the things that we need to do in the entirely new environment around the world. So that's my reaction. Obviously, we hope that there will be no dramatic actions by any of the states parties, and I trust that there are views like this and communications taking place from various corners of the world, including many of our states parties or UN member states. Over to you, Anton.
Thank you, High Representative Nakamitsu. At this point, I would like to adjust the rules of our meeting today, since we have 2 more questions and 13 minutes left. So I would like to give the floor to 2 participants who raised their hands to ask questions, Tariq Rauf and Denis Zhuykov, and then be back to all presenters for their final remarks. And High Representative Nakamitsu, if you will have any additional thoughts, I will give you a floor at the very end. So Tariq Rauf next, Denis Zhuykov right after.
Thank you very much, Anton. Can you hear me?
Yes, sure, please.
So I have 2 very...
Tariq, we lost your voice. Tariq, we lost your voice. Please.
Very quick question. My mic is unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, please. Now it's good.
My question is to Ambassador Aidan Little and to Ambassador Benno Lagner. In 2008, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, in violation of Principle 12 from 1995, gave an exception to a non-NPT state. And one of the price that was paid was that Argentina and Brazil argued that the quadripartite agreement between them would be equivalent to the additional protocol, and that was agreed by the NSG members. So how would one square the circle in calling for universal acceptance of the additional protocol, but have 2 important states, Argentina and Brazil, go to the review conference without the additional protocol in force? And a quick question to Ambassador Flores. Mexico is part of the 17-country joint communique issued in New York. And I was wondering whether there was any discussion of the 17 countries of the joint communique finding some common ground with the 16 countries of the Stockholm Initiative to find a few issues that they could take jointly to the review conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. The floor for the last final question now goes to Denis Zhuykov. Denis, can you hear us? We cannot hear you. Denis, can you hear us? We do not hear you. Okay, then I think we will go back to the presenters. So Professor Porter, you have the floor. Bill, we cannot hear you, I'm afraid.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I'll be very, very brief. I want to suggest that the issue that was raised by Daryl in particular is of utmost importance, and I would hope, based upon what Aidan mentioned in terms of the priorities for consideration by the P5, that the question of the potential for resumption of nuclear tests also has to be part of that P5 deliberation, whether it fits in under dialogue, risk reduction. I think this is of utmost importance and hopefully will be a subject of discussion. I want to reiterate the importance of work to somehow reinforce the norm of non-use that the High Representative mentioned, whether it's a reiteration of the principle that was best known as the Reagan-Gorbachev principle, or by some other term. I think that really is crucial. And finally, I would note that while it's very difficult for me to find areas where there might be, in fact, convergence of views that would lead to some kind of a consensus, I was impressed at the 2019 PrepCom by the very meaty statement that was made by over 50 states dealing with disarmament and non-proliferation education. And while that may not be the most important topic for many, I do think it's an area where consensus is possible. And as we are forward looking at this moment in time, I would hope that one might also include the topic of education as a significant one, and one in which agreement might be reached across both nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states and across different regional groupings. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Ambassador Socorro Flores next, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very briefly, I think Gaukar said it very well. The challenges we are facing now are beyond the NPT, and we all need to carefully reflect on what kind of world are we envisaging. So I think using this time, the coming months, to reflect on how to strengthen the NPT regime, it's a very important issue. But we cannot come to a conference when we are not committing to the past commitments. I'm sorry to say it that way, but there is a floor, and the floor is the recognition of commitments and implementation. And I know it's very difficult. Many of you have said that we need to make a very careful assessment, and I absolutely agree. But that assessment has to start by recognition of existing commitments. And I think that is the basis for advancing. And I fully agree with what the President, Gustavo Schlauben, said about we need to find a balance across the three pillars and to see where can we move together to build a strengthened NPT regime. To respond to the question of Raul, this was not discussed between the countries that issued the communique and the members of the Stockholm initiative. But I think if we all recognize that we need to enhance dialogue and understanding, this is part of a discussion that we should have in the coming months. So the time is short. I don't think it's realistic to think in a long outcome document, but if we want a conference that will strengthen the NPT, we have to start by making an honest assessment and trying to go exactly with flexibility and really with the idea of not creating more challenges, but to keep the system that for so many years we have created and still working. And it's a very relevant part of the non-proliferation regime. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Little.
Thanks very much. And let me just start by echoing what Socorro said. I couldn't have put that any better. I think that's exactly the right approach we need to be taking into the RevCon. A couple of specific questions just to pick up. Amir, very nice to see you. Thank you for your question on the Bangkok Treaty. I mean, we've had it on our agenda now for a couple of years that we want to make progress on signing the protocol to the Bangkok Treaty. We had a really good meeting with the ASEAN Secretary General when he was in Geneva last summer. And we've had various meetings in New York as well. I think at the moment we're really waiting for a signal from the ASEAN side. I know it was discussed at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, I think back in July, and I think we're sort of ready really for sort of enhanced dialogue from there. So this is something I think we can sort of pick up in the hiatus that we're now in. But I think we still need to sort of do a bit more work to understand each other's positions really between the P5 and ASEAN. But that's something we're absolutely ready to take forward. So look forward to further conversations on that. Tarek's question on the nuclear suppliers group, I will happily leave to Benno as an expert on NSG matters, which I am not. But I wanted to pick up something that Benno said earlier, which is that he hopes that the pandemic didn't distract from the NPT at the expense of to the advantage of bioweapons and biosecurity. Now, from my point of view, actually, we could do with a bit more attention on biosecurity and bioweapons, and that's been the case for several years. So actually, I hope that the pandemic does refocus attention on that. But I agree with him that there are other important issues, and the NPT is absolutely front and center of the security regime. So I take the point he was making. But I think I'd just like to finish really by picking up on what Gustavo said about green shoots, and I think we've heard a few mentions in this conversation to various initiatives and statements. There's the Stepping Stones statement from Berlin. There was the 50th anniversary statement by that group of 17 countries that was mentioned. Vanessa's mentioned the work that the NPDI have been doing, and I'm certainly looking forward to seeing the results of that. And there are plenty of others. And while, of course, we're not negotiating yet, and I couldn't sign up on the spot to all of those things, all of these statements and initiatives are clearly good faith efforts to try and find common ground, and I think that's really encouraging. And so I hope that we can use the next few months to really deepen the conversation from here and try and arrive in New York as well prepared as possible. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Little. Ambassador Logner.
Well, thank you, but I think I'll only be able to answer Vanessa's question. You're right, Vanessa. Risk reduction has been a priority issue for Switzerland, where we have also become a champion on this issue in the SG's disarmament agenda. Now, what the RevCom should do is, I'll give you 3 points. First of all, we should have a clear declaratory commitment by nuclear weapon states against any use of nuclear weapons. We've heard a lot about renewing the Reagan-Gorbachev statement, whether this is the right format or a different kind, but some kind of a declaratory statement making clear that use of nuclear weapons should be avoided. Second, the P5, the nuclear weapon states, should of course continue and deepen their dialogue on strategic stability. And this should include a discussion both on risks related with current policies, doctrines and postures, but also looking at risks stemming from new technologies, new capabilities. Thirdly, we would want the nuclear weapon states to develop some practical measures to reduce risks. There are technical measures that can be looked into. There are confidence building measures, measures in the area of communication. I'll just leave it there. But most importantly, I think risk reduction should not be a one-off issue for the review conference. It should be an issue with a continued focus during the entire review cycle following the review conference. So maybe coming up with a kind of a risk reduction work plan that will take us through the review cycle until the next review conference, using the prep comps also for reporting back to all the states parties on what has been done in these areas by the nuclear weapon states, and so to have a continued and substantive conversation on this issue over a longer period of time. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lagner. Gauhar, please.
Thank you. I don't think there are any questions specifically to me, but the broader question of what can states parties do in the meantime, I would just go back to my point about seriously considering what in practical terms they want to get out of the review and how to build on the past commitments and reach out to other groupings, regional issue-based groupings, and use this time if even they are unable to meet in person, but this actually in some respects makes it easier to organize virtual consultations, to reach out and really try to understand where everybody stands and try to flesh out, not necessarily negotiated language, but at least some common areas where agreement could be possible on the measures building on the past commitments of the REDCON. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Zlauvidin.
Thank you, Anton, and thank you to all the those who place very interesting questions. Some of them have already been answered by other panel members. Others, I believe, that will need further considerations. They are complex issues that we are dealing with now. But let me just express a general view that I have. As by nature, I'm a very optimistic man, but also a very realistic one. Of course, I understand and I realize the complexity and how difficult the situation is in the world, not only in terms of the pandemic, but as many said about the current set of affairs of the global security climate, which many consider, and I believe so, which is deteriorating past commitments on arms control treaties and by decisions, just being taken by some state parties. If one were to consider that, yes, many would say that the 10th Review Conference, whenever it may take place, have no chance of reaching any outcome at all, whichever format may have or may like to have. But still, always I like to remind myself how difficult was, I wasn't there obviously, but how difficult it was for our forebears, our predecessors, that negotiated the treaty itself in the midst of the Cold War. So now if we were to have to negotiate that treaty back in the 70s, probably will be facing even more difficult challenges than today. The same goes for our predecessors 25 years ago, that they have to negotiate not only the indefinite extension of the treaty, but also the decisions and the resolutions on the Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone. That was not easy to achieve, and some that have participated today were there in 1995 and can testify that it was not an easy diplomatic feat. So this is not the first, probably not the last time that we as a community, as NPT state parties and stakeholders, we have faced it in the past, and we may continue to face it in the years to come. So this should not be an excuse, not to do our best as state parties, as NPT officials and civil society members, to give up immediately, or even just to use that excuse to keep pushing and postponing the review conference, for no reasons. I believe that we have to hold the bull as it comes and do our best and try to find, as I said, what are those commonalities, that common ground that unite us. And I do believe, and I say that in all my consultations with state parties and delegations in Geneva, New York, and Vienna, all of them, all delegations that took the floor, reiterated the importance of the NPT and how important it is to keep its credibility and integrity. No one No one spoke against the NPT. And I think that in itself is a success, and we have to keep building up. It's not perfect. The implementation is far from perfect on many aspects that have been raised today. I'm not going to repeat that, but that should not shine us away from our responsibility, which is prepare ourselves the best as we can and go to review conference ready to have the best outcome possible, whichever that outcome may be. That's my message as a president designate, and hopefully everyone will be in the same page, regardless of their national positions, regardless of the national interest. But I believe that it's everybody's interest that the NPT preserve its credibility, integrity, and we keep moving on and keep strengthening, but in particular, strengthening the implementation of all the obligations under the treaty. Thank you, Anton, and thank you all the organizers.
Thank you, Ambassador Zlouverinen. The final question I have to UN High Representative Izumi Nakamitsu. Ms. Nakamitsu, do you have any further reactions or responses? Because the final question was asked before you had the floor.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I will just say a few words as a concluding remark, but please go ahead.
No, I mean, that's it. If you have final remarks, please go ahead with the final remarks, because after that, I'm going to close the session because we run out of time.
Okay, all right. No, thank you. Thank you so much. They have been all said. The things that I wanted to repeat have always been in the minds of our collaborators. So, you know, it really shows that we are thinking in the same way. If I borrow the expression of Ambassador Zlouverinen, I think we are now on the same page. There are some concrete things that we could do. You know, non-use principle to be reaffirmed. It doesn't have to be exactly like Reagan-Gorbachev statement, but I think there are ways to reflect that and reaffirm that in the context of NPT review process. I noted with interest what Professor Porto said about nuclear testing, and I'm sure Ambassador Little has already been thinking about those issues to be also discussed in the context of N5 platforms. But I wanted to actually end with what Gorka says. You know, the increasing tension, the rhetorics, deteriorating strategic environment is not just because of one leader of one country or any leader of any of the superpowers. I think this really indeed reflects something of a profound shift or evolution of the overall security geopolitical situation. And we need to actually get to the bottom of it. And that's why the Secretary General himself also stated in the CD last year, there is probably a need for a new vision for disarmament and arms control. And I think the NPT provides a very important platform for us to all start doing that. So let us not miss this opportunity. We know that NPT has been extremely resilient. It's been, you know, we don't believe that even if we don't have a successful outcome document or documents, plural, NPT is not going to collapse. It's been very resilient, very successful. But resilience and relevance are two different things. We also need to make sure that NPT will be relevant in the context of the current or evolving geopolitical security environments. So let's use this opportunity to start reflecting really where we are at the global security level environment, and what are the things that we need to do. And I hope that the next review conference, the 10th review conference, will be a springboard for that, because this is, in the end, all about our common security. So with that, thank you so much. There are some really good practical ideas that came up. One good thing is that people still remain extremely engaged in this issue. And so I am encouraged. Let's keep up this momentum and work hard for the NPT Review Conference a successful outcome as well as beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, High Representative Nakamitsu, and I apologize that we don't have more time for questions and comments from the participants. I have no plans to summarize everything that has been said during the last 19 minutes. I would like to thank all presenters and the participants who have spent with us last 90 minutes. Very special thanks to the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs and the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies for their cooperation in organizing this virtual meeting. My best wishes to all participants, and stay safe and healthy in these unprecedented times. Now the meeting is over. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much, Anton. Thanks.